We're here today to learn a little bit more about economics, and to teach us we have none other than the celebrated Professor David Dunkin.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Jim. I like
It's a little late, but I think.
All right, so for the topic is supply and demand, and we're going to start with the first half, which is demand. And demand starts with a proposition known as the law of demand. Okay, and the law of demand is just the idea that as the price of a good rises, the quantity bought and sold falls.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, and so this makes sense because consumers are constrained in what they can do with their resources, and if the only thing that changes is a price of some good gets cheaper, then a consumer is able to buy more of that. They have an incentive to buy goods, so they'll buy more. Seem too clear. So let's look at supply and demand in a graph, because everything in economics is a graph. So we graph the quantity on the horizontal axis and the price on the vertical axis. And so if the price, for example, were P1, which is high, we would expect to see a low quantity demanded. Okay? So that's just depicting this first proposition on the graph. We now need to consider what if the price were low, and we would expect a higher quantity demanded. All right, so we don't need to fill in every single point here. We can just draw a line through the 2 points, and we'll call that line demand. So the important thing to note here is that the whole line is demand, not any particular combination of price and quantity that you would read off the line.
So David, are you just saying basically that people like to buy things when they're less expensive and they buy less of it when it's more expensive?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. So it's as simple as that, and this is just that concept represented in a picture.
David, does this picture give us what the demand for something would be at a particular point in time? But it might change, right? What if, for example, the population increased?
Right. So that's a terrific segue into, so as I just said, the whole line is the relationship for whatever good we're talking about, and it's correct for some given time or circumstance, but things change. I mean, things in economics are always changing. So let's say that this is depicting the demand for apples, and a news report comes out that says that apples prevent cancer. Okay, and suddenly apples would become more popular, and people would be willing to buy more apples at every price. Right? And so if I draw a higher quantity at every price, I'm going to shift the whole line. So things like that. Let's call this D and this D prime. And this is apples said to prevent cancer. Right? And we say, in economic terms, we say that demand demand increases. So when we say, when something like this happens that moves the whole line, we say demand increases.
And is this shifting up or out?
This is shifting, we like to say shifting out. Okay, because when we get to supply, we'll see that saying up, shifting up or down could be confusing. But if we say shift out and shift in, for example, if apples had somehow been found to be bad for you, then that would have caused the line to shift in. And that would have been a decrease in demand. Okay? Yes?
So this is basically saying that demand will increase for that particular reason at a higher price.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, yeah, thanks for that, because that's a great question. So what I'm saying is, from the result of this shift, at any given price, let's say P1, the quantity demanded increased. So if you're reading a price quantity combination, that's quantity demanded. If you're talking about the line, that's demand. Right? So if the price falls, the quantity demanded increases. If apples become more popular for some reason, demand increases and the quantity demanded at every price increases. Okay? All right, so there's a number of these shifters for demand. Some important ones. We already mentioned one, which was preferences. All right, so if we said that apples became, for some reason, thought to be more healthy, then people's preferences for apples might change. Others are the number of buyers. So if we had an influx of consumers, they would likely purchase apples, and that would increase the amount sold at every price.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's look at the law of supply. Similarly, the law of supply is just the proposition that as the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied rises. So price and quantity supplied move together. Okay, and in a picture, we would just put price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal, and at a high price, say P1, we would expect to see a high quantity offered for sale by suppliers. And that makes sense because if you're selling a good and the price goes up, you're going to want to sell more of it. You're going to be incented to take greater efforts to bring it to market. Similarly, if we consider a low price, we would expect a low quantity offered for sale. And then just like we did with demand, we don't have to plot every single price and quantity combination. We can just connect up the 2 points in a line that we'll call supply. So again, just like we said with demand, supply refers to the entire line. Anytime I'm given a particular price, I use the line to read off a particular quantity, which I'll call the quantity supplied, which shouldn't be confused with supply, because supply is the whole relationship, the line.
So this is just like people who sell stuff want to sell it for more.
Yeah, the higher price they're going to get, the more they're going to offer for sale. So just like with demand, there are things that aren't shown directly on the graph that can affect the relationship. For instance, if a large number of new sellers come into a market, then we would expect to see at every given price a higher quantity offered for sale. So an influx of more sellers, more quantity offered for sale, so influx of sellers shifts supply out. Okay? And then similarly, we have every price quantity combination on the new supply line, I'll call supply prime, giving us a higher quantity for sale at every price. So another important shifter for sellers is technology advances. So technology often reduces the cost to produce a good. And when a good costs you less to produce, you're able to produce more of it at a given price and sell more of it. So technology lowers cost, increases supply. So these are probably the two most important shifters of supply.
So when the supply line shifts out, does that also change the price?
Well, okay, so in order to know what price emerges in the market and what quantity actually gets sold, you actually have to put supply and demand together.
Okay.
So this is only telling us about supplier behavior. Demand only told us about consumer behavior. So it's only when we put both those behaviors together that we can make any sort of prediction about a market.
And is that our next move?
Yes. Okay, so now we're ready to put supply and demand together and talk about equilibrium. So rather than give a definition of equilibrium, I'm just going to use the graphs like we would in economics to show what it is and then talk about what it means. So again, we've got price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. And all we need is a downward sloping demand curve for whatever product we're talking about. Does somebody have a product in mind?
Apple. Why don't we stick with Apple?
Okay, so we'll talk about the supply and demand of apples, or the market for apples, because that's what we're describing. So the blue line will describe the demand for apples, and just as a refresher, downward sloping because at high prices we expect consumers are only willing to buy low quantities, and at low prices consumers are willing to buy higher quantities. So downward sloping demand curve. Now we want to think about supplier behavior, people who sell apples. We're going to have an upward sloping supply curve. Right, and this just reflects the supplier behavior that the higher the price that they're getting in the market, the more likely they are to supply a high quantity. Okay? So then immediately, if you're like me, you're drawn to the intersection of the two lines. That's very attractive and a very natural thing to do. So let's talk about this particular price and quantity combination, which I'm going to refer to as the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay? So if we think about this for a second, it is the only price and quantity combination on this picture where buyers are willing to buy exactly the same quantity that suppliers are willing to offer for sale. Right? So it makes sense that if suppliers were trying to charge a price up here, buyers would only be willing to buy this quantity, and they would be left with a surplus of goods for sale that they would want to get rid of. So they would likely lower the price. Similarly, if they were for some reason charging a price down here, buyers would be willing to buy more, and sellers would hike their price up because they would be selling out of their goods immediately. So they would realize they could get a higher price, and they would raise their prices. It's only at this equilibrium point where we're in balance. If we find ourselves, if for some reason this market gets to this spot, there's no incentive for buyers or sellers to do anything different. They continue to buy this quantity, and they continue to offer this quantity for sale. There's no surplus, no shortage. It's the market clearing price and quantity, and economics predicts, this model of supply and demand predicts that this is the price and quantity you would expect to see in the market.
Is this the invisible hand?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Exactly. There's a little bit more to talk about.